Thank you, Tim, for your introduction. It is a pleasure to be here at Pepperdine University this afternoon. I used to teach at the University of Miami, so when I came here today and saw the beautiful view of the Pacific you've got here, it reminded me of Miami days. My office there was on the top of the tallest building on campus, and I had a view of the Atlantic Ocean from my office every day. I'd walk in, and what would I see? I would, well, not from here, but from wherever it is you get the view of the Pacific here, I'd see that every day. So coming here to this campus has been a wonderful reminder of that. You've got a great location, and it's a pleasure to be here, and you've got a great faculty to study with. So as far as an intellectual experience goes, welcome to religious studies. I'm here today to speak about Jewish biblical theology. And while I teach in a Christian seminary, Claremont School of Theology, which has grown Claremont Lincoln University, I am a Jewish Bible professor there. And you can all tell that by the name Sweeney, because of course that's a Jewish name, right? Well, it happens to be a Jewish name. Since I was born, it's been Jewish. And while I was trained at Claremont as well, I was trained in biblical theology. And while I was undertaking graduate study, I took courses in what was called in Christian circles Old Testament theology, and asked my professor in one class, why is it that you don't see Jewish Bible theologies? He didn't have much of an answer. Well, there hasn't been much interest in the field, but being trained in the field and thinking in terms of what contribution can I make to Jewish thought, and how does that relate to Christian understandings of Bible as well, I was motivated to write a Jewish Bible theology. It's been published by Fortress this past year. It's called Tanakh, which is the acronym for the Jewish Bible, and I want to unpack that term this afternoon. Now, I had thought about reading a manuscript to you, but after seeing the Pacific out there and seeing your lounge area over here, decided it might be a good idea not to read a manuscript to you, but to talk instead. And so what I'm going to do is talk about three different topics. One is the character of biblical theology in general. Two is the difference between the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible. And three is the dialogical character of that Bible. Now, first, the character of biblical theology. Most of you, I think you've got, an academic requirement here to take a course in Bible as part of your undergraduate programs? Okay, so you probably had an introduction to Hebrew Bible or an introduction to New Testament or perhaps a combined course. And when we think about Bible, especially in a Lutheran university or a religious university, one of the questions that you want to pose is, well, what does it mean? You know, we can look at the past and understand antiquity, but one of the questions is, what does it mean today as well? And when you look at the field of biblical theology, it tries to combine the past with the present. The problem is, biblical theology reached a stalling point in the 20th century, about the time most of you were probably born. And over the course of the 20th century, you saw any number of major biblical theologies that were written by Christian scholars. Probably the most important one was written by a German scholar named Gerhard von Rott. Published a theology in the 1950s that focused on the Old Testament and tried to interpret the Old Testament as an expression of what was called Heilsgeschichte in German. And those of you who speak German know what that means. Those of you who don't speak German, it means salvation history. And basically, von Rott interpreted the Old Testament as a largely historical theological work that would take a history of Israel's relationship with God and point ultimately beyond the Old Testament to what would be understood as the New Testament, of a sense of God directing and involved in Israel's history through time. The problem is, when you read von Rott's Old Testament theology, it doesn't quite work. Because if you know the Old Testament made reference to the book of Job earlier this afternoon, not everything in the Old Testament is historical. Job poses questions of what is righteous in the world. Is God righteous? that has little to do with theology, but in our world, in which we've seen the Holocaust or the Shoah, that question of righteousness and was God present, or did God engage in some kind of an agreement with Satan that caused suffering to Job, the Jewish people, and the world at large, becomes a dominant question that Van Rott doesn't ask. And so he couldn't really take up the wisdom literature, Job, Proverbs, Song of Songs, Esther. He doesn't even mention in his theology. He couldn't cover the whole Old Testament. Another important theology was Walter Eichrodt. Swiss, wrote in German, wrote in the 1930s, right before World War II. Published the Theology 1933, 1939. One of the worst periods in Western history. He tried to interpret the entire Old Testament from the standpoint of covenant, and had the same problem that Van Rott had. Covenant is an important concept in the Hebrew Bible. You see it in Genesis, it's presupposed throughout the prophets, the historical books, they've all got it. But covenant, you don't always see everywhere. Again, wisdom literature. Where does covenant come into play? And so for Eichrodt, he had a theological concept that didn't cover the entirety of the Hebrew Bible, and thus provided, in many respects, a stimulating theology, but an incomplete one, that was motivated like Van Rott. Van Rott, Heilsgeschichte, moved from past to future, Old Testament to new. For Eichrodt, covenant was really asking the question of how does the Old Testament covenant, the Old Covenant at Sinai, or Mosaic covenant, relate to a new covenant or New Testament? In Christianity, what does Jesus Christ mean? So he ends up with an incomplete theology as well. Can't deal with the wisdom books. Third major proposal was Brevard Childs. Major modern scholar, just passed away a few years ago. He chose a very different basis. Didn't want to look for a single theme that would unite the entire Hebrew Bible, like Van Rott and Eichrodt had proposed. Rather, he took a canonical approach. How do you interpret all the books of the Bible in their final form as part of a single system? And so with his canonical approach to the theology of the Hebrew Bible, Childs wrote a book that gave an exposition of every book of the Hebrew Bible in its final form and tried to put them together to form the canon of the Old Testament, or the final form of the Old Testament. Problem is, if you look at the structure of the Old Testament in Christianity, you're going to find that different communities have different canons. Cal Lutheran is a Lutheran university. And so most of you are going to presuppose a Protestant understanding of the Bible. If you are Christian and Roman Catholic, you've got a different definition of Bible. Books such as 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Ben Sira, or Ecclesiasticus as it's known, Tobit, Judith, the Wisdom of Solomon, the Epistle of Jeremiah. Those are all part of the Roman Catholic canon. In Protestant canons, they're the Apocrypha. They have a somewhat different status than the Old Testament and the New Testament. They're different and not considered quite as holy, but because of tradition, they're still included but treated differently. Childs couldn't deal with that. He was a Protestant scholar, didn't treat the Apocrypha. If you look elsewhere in the world, Ethiopia, major Christian community in Ethiopia, and guess what? The Ethiopian Bible has a different structure and content of the Bible as well. It includes books that are not part of the Apocrypha. The book of Enoch, for example, an apocalyptic book that looks at visions of heaven. The book of Jubilees, which is a rewritten form of Genesis. Both constitute portions of the canon in Ethiopian Christianity. Childs couldn't deal with that. Basically, in Christianity, you've got a number of Bibles. And so Childs' concept of canon was actually very limited. You've got a number of different structures of the Bible that he couldn't deal with.
So these are the problems. You have three major proposals and any number more, but none of them could ever deal fully with the concept of an Old Testament theology or a theology of the Hebrew Bible. And so that brings us to our second subtopic. What is a Jewish Bible theology and what is a Christian Bible theology? How do they differ? And part of it is that they're going to be based on the different forms of the Bible in Judaism and Christianity. When you think about a biblical theology, we oftentimes think that we've got the Bible. But the fact of the matter is, we've got more than one Bible floating around. They may have the same basic books, but they are arranged differently, and in Christianity, oftentimes include books that you're not going to find in the Jewish Bible. So let's take Christianity first. When you look at Christianity and ask, what is the Old Testament? First of all, you have to recognize that's a theologically loaded term. The term testament in English means covenant. Old covenant, Mosaic covenant, and New Testament means New Testament, or the covenant through Christianity understood through Jesus Christ. There's a sense of movement through history from the one to the other, old to new. There's a sense of fulfillment in Christianity in new. And there's a sense that the Old Testament is basically a product of the past that doesn't have quite the same standing that it does in relation to the new. So that becomes one basic issue of structure in the Christian Bible. Two parts, Old Testament, New Testament. When you look at the Old Testament, you're going to find that it has a very specific structure. In fact, if you, most of you are going to be reading out of English Bibles, and that structure is evident in printed editions of the Christian Bible today. What do you use for a study text? Oxford Annotated? Okay, Oxford Annotated, or Harper Bible, Harper Collins Study Bible. You know, you're going to see an order, a specific order in 4 parts that actually goes back to the early history of Christianity, which read the Septuagint, or the Greek version of the Bible, as basic scripture. And when you look at the Septuagint, the Greek version, why did early Christians read the Greek version of the Bible? Because they spoke Greek. They didn't read Hebrew. In our world, in the Western world, people speak English widely. If you're going to have a major translation, it would be an English version. In the ancient world, and the time of early Christianity in the Roman Empire, people, educated people, were speaking Greek and still kept their local dialects, whether it was Aramaic or an Egyptian dialect or Latin or what have you. But Greek was the language of international discourse. And so Greek represented one of the major witnesses to the Bible in antiquity. Now, when you read that Bible in Greek, and when you read the New Testament, and it cites the Old Testament, it's citing the Greek version. For example, Gospel of Matthew cites Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, that speaks about a son being born to, in Greek, Parthenes, a virgin. If you read the Hebrew text, the Hebrew term is alma, which does not mean virgin. It means a young woman who is capable of bearing children. It has nothing to do with her virginity. Now, how many of you speak more than one language? Okay? Those of you who speak more than one language, you know that if you move from one language to another, you never get an exact correspondence between them. You have a different understanding as you move from one language to another. When you translate from one language to another, you give a different nuance to whatever your text is. And the New Testament citation of Isaiah is one of those cases. Basically, virgin comes up in the New Testament in Greek, from the Greek tradition, how the Greek understood the Hebrew, but it gives a different sense of text. And yet that became normative in Christianity. When you look at the Septuagint, throughout you're going to see a translation of a Hebrew text that oftentimes gives a different nuance to that Hebrew. But you're also going to see a different structure. The earliest form of the Greek Bible we know is Codex Vaticanus. That is a manuscript of the entire Bible, Christian Bible, Old Testament and New, that dates to the 4th century CE, about the time that Christianity became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire, under Constantine and his successors. And the organization of that manuscript is very telling. It's not just an accidental organization. It gives a sense of the theology of how the Old Testament and New Testament were read in Codex Vaticanus. That structure includes 4 basic parts. The first part of the Christian Old Testament is called the Pentateuch. It includes the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And when you read the contents of the Pentateuch, what you're looking at is, in fact, an account of the early history of humankind with a specific focus on Israel. So that when you read Genesis, you read an account of creation. You read accounts of the first ancestors of Israel: Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, and then Joseph and the other sons of Jacob. When you read Exodus, you read the Independence Day story of Israel. The exodus of Israel from Egyptian bondage, going out into the wilderness, receiving Torah at Mount Sinai, and then being led through the wilderness to the promised land of Israel. And by the time you get to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, you've been taken through an entire period of history prior to Israel's existence as a nation in the land of Israel. Last book is Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, giving his speeches to Israel on the last day of his life, as he, in effect, repeats the revelation of Torah at Sinai to remind Israel of its obligations to God before they cross over and take possession of the promised land. Of course, if you know Deuteronomy well, and I know we've got some people here who do, you know that Deuteronomy is in many respects a rewriting of the laws you're going to see in Exodus, that they really update. And I know you've got a law school here. I used to be pre-law advisor at the University of Miami, sent a lot of people here, but it actually represents a living tradition of law. How do you deal with the problems that older laws don't address? Well, you revise those laws. And in fact, Deuteronomy represents, in many respects, a revision of law that you'll see in the book of Exodus and Numbers. But this gives you, the Pentateuch gives you the earliest history of Israel. The second major component of the Christian Old Testament is the historical books. So you've got Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and in Roman Catholic Bibles, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, sometimes, but not always. That's another issue. But basically, historical books that pick up the narrative thread from the time that Israel enters the land of Canaan to take possession of it under Joshua, and gives you a history of Israel's existence in the land of Israel. So you start with the book of Joshua, which gives you the account of how Israel conquers the promised land. Basically, get rid of all the Canaanites, and then it becomes Israel. Then you look at Judges, which starts out by saying, well, wait a minute, all the Canaanites are still there. It gives you a little bit of a different perspective in the book of Judges, and then lays out a scenario in which Israel is accused of worshiping idols and whatnot, following foreign gods, and you see the whole country dipping into chaos. By the end of the book of Judges, you've got a scenario where a Levite, a priest, comes to a city in Israel. He brings his secondary wife, a concubine, with him. And like Sodom and Gomorrah, when he brings his concubine to the city of Gibeah, the men there want to rape her, which they do, and she dies as a result. And when you see a story like this at the end of Judges, it's a horrible story. The reason it's there is to show the reader there's need for a righteous king. When you read the book of Ruth, you see a story of women who are in poverty. How are they going to get out of that poverty? They're foreigners. They come back to Israel. After Ruth's husband dies, she comes back to his native land, Israel, and eventually marries a man in Israel that supports the family, but they have to struggle in this period. It's a period of need and want. And so that then gives you the books of Samuel, where you start to get the account of how does Israel get a king. So you see the first attempt under King Saul, then you see the second attempt under King David, and then you get a history of the royal house of David that takes you through the end of Kings through the Babylonian exile, which gives you a history from Joshua through Babylonian exile. Chronicles then repeats that history from a different historical viewpoint, points forward to the time at the end of the exile when King Cyrus of Persia is going to announce the return of Jews to the land of Israel. Ezra Nehemiah then gives you an account of that return, the rebuilding of the temple, the rebuilding of the land of Israel. Esther looks at issues in the post-exilic period, living in diaspora, and basically takes you from the time of Joshua, the formation of Israel as a nation, through the period of the second temple, or the post-exilic diaspora. So you've got a later history that is presented in the historical books. Then the third segment of the Christian Old Testament is the wisdom and poetic books. Here you find books that take up questions that any one of us could ask at any time in our lives today, as well as questions that could be asked in antiquity. It includes the book of Psalms, when people speak to God. And oftentimes we're taught the Psalms deal with praise God. You know, God is king. Gives you the good side. But the fact of the matter is, when you read Psalms, the most common form in the book of Psalms is the lament. Oh God, help us. We're starving to death. The enemies are coming to attack us. Why are you hiding your face? We've done everything you asked. Please help us. That's the voice of humans addressing God. We can ask that question today in many parts of the world, as you know. There's a whole world out there starving to death that needs help. It's a very important question for today, as well as in the past. Likewise, not only Psalms, but you've got the wisdom books. You've got Proverbs that postulates a very ordered world. You want to know how the world works? Like Solomon, go out and observe the world. Look at how the ants organize their life. Gives you a model for an organized society. Look at how animals interact with each other. Look at how men and women interact with each other. Look at how to eat at the king's table. How do you live your life in this world? Which is a question we can always ask. Any of you ever get invited to dinner with Governor Jerry Brown? How do you conduct yourself at that dinner? What do you wear? What do you eat? Do you gobble everything down first, or do you act politely? Proverbs teaches you those kinds of lessons, how to conduct yourself in the world. Then you look at a book like Job. In contrast to Proverbs, Job asks, what goes wrong in our world? What happens when God allows us to suffer? Sometimes the righteous suffer. How many of you know somebody who's righteous who suffers? You're young now. Any of you ever encountered cancer in your families? Does it look for people who have sinned? Does it avoid people who are righteous? Probably not. I hope you haven't had much experience with that, but you will in life. Okay, and so that question, why do people suffer? And have you ever noticed people who are probably not your moral paragons? Why do they prosper? Does that ever happen? You know, we live in Los Angeles. We've got a crime rate through the roof. You know, a lot of those people are prospering. Job asked those questions. Why do the righteous suffer, and why do the wicked prosper? Because it's not always clear why that happens. Same question we can ask today. So you've got the wisdom and prophetic books, the wisdom and poetic books deal with questions of the everyday present. So we've got a scenario. Distant past in the Pentateuch, later past in the historical books, present in the wisdom and poetic books. And we go to the fourth section of the Christian Old Testament, the prophets. Those are the figures who look to what? The future. They're looking to the future. They want to know what went wrong in their society, and they argue that God's got a plan. And in the future, once punishment or once destruction or evil is done, there will be a brilliant future of restoration. Now, when you think about the placement of the prophets in the Christian Old Testament, after you've gone through the four portions of the Christian Old Testament, what comes next? The New Testament. And so when the prophets are pointing forward, canonically speaking, as read in Christianity, they point towards the New Testament. Jesus Christ represents that fulfillment, which basic tenet of Christian theology. And when you look at the structure of the Christian New Testament, you see a similar structure in the Old. Earliest history, the Gospels, the life and death of Jesus. Later history, the book of Acts of the Apostles, which gives you the later history of the early Christian church through the time in which it arrives in Rome. Third section of the New Testament, the epistles of Paul and others that deal with questions of theology and practice and the self-understanding of Christians that are still asked today. And the fourth section of the New Testament looks towards the future, the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, that's asking the question, when does Jesus come again? Christianity is based on a linear understanding of progression in history. And sometimes God calls us up to say, well, wait a minute, Sweeney, there's a point you forgot. But we'll let God take care of that one. But you want to note this sense of linear history that you see at the basis of the structure of the Christian New Testament. And one of the realities is that while most of our English Bibles employ this structure today, if you look at the manuscript history of the Greek Bible, you'll see a number of different organizations. Likewise, if you look at the Ethiopic or the Syriac or other Bibles, you'll see other organizations. This is one organization, but it's a very telling structure, theologically speaking, to give expression to Christian thought of the understanding of world history through the canon. When you look at the Jewish Bible, you're going to see a very different structure of the Bible. The Jewish Bible is not composed in 4 parts, it's composed in 3. And it is called, in Hebrew, Tanakh. T-A-N-A-K. Tanakh is an acronym that expresses the titles of the 3 basic parts of the Jewish Bible in Hebrew. And that includes the Torah, that is instruction, divine instruction, as the first part. That's the T. The second part is the prophets. In Hebrew, Nevi'im. That's the N. And then the third part is the writings, in Hebrew, Ketuvim. That'll be the third major section. That's the K. Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Instruction, prophets, writings. Now, when you look at the Torah, a couple of points. First of all, most of you are taught by the New Testament to read the Hebrew word Torah as law. When you read the New Testament, the epistles of Paul, he will use the Greek term nomos to translate the Hebrew word Torah. Nomos in Greek means law. Torah in Hebrew does not. If you want law in Hebrew, use mishpat, oftentimes translated as justice. Torah is derived from the verb root yara, which means to guide. And hence the noun Torah means guidance or instruction. And if you read the books of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, same books you'll find in Christianity, it's not just law. Law appears in the Pentateuch or in the Torah, but you also get a narrative. Who are we as Israel? Descendants of Abraham and Sarah. Special relationship with God. It gives the reader a sense of identity. This is who our ancestors are. And each one of you has a set of ancestors from your past. you usually carry a last name that will give your father's name, your father's family name, that gives you a sense of family history and identity. Who are you is related to your family. The Torah in Judaism serves that function. Who are we as a people? When you come to the United States, because we're all here descendants of immigrants, except a few of you who might be descendants of American Indians. I'm a descendant of the Mattaponi, but a small part of my background. Some of you may have Indian identity as well. When we come here, even if we come in later periods, or our ancestors come, we adopt an American identity. How many of your ancestors came here on the Mayflower? None? Okay, mine didn't either. But we all celebrate Thanksgiving as if we did. It becomes part of our identity as Americans. And so we buy into that identity even if our ancestors came at a later time. Or later on, our descendants may make a similar decision to identify as Americans. That sense of identity is the basis of Torah. And in presenting that sense of identity, the legal material then comes in and asks, how do we set up a just society that can live and function? What are the laws that govern our society? If you read the legal portions of the Pentateuch, you're going to get not only religious laws, but how do you deal with civil and criminal issues? How do you deal with issues of murder? How do you deal with property issues? What happens if somebody steals from you? What happens? What obligations does a society have to its poor? In fact, if you're watching the presidential debates, and tonight is the vice presidential debate, what obligations does a society have to its people is a major issue in this election. Obamacare or Romney care, depending on what your politics might happen to be. This is a major issue in the current presidential election, and the laws of the Pentateuch have the same issues. What obligations do we have to the poor? When you plow your field, every 7th year, you leave it fallow. You leave it lying untouched so that the poor can find food there. You don't harvest the corners of your field, again, so the poor can find food in your fields. It becomes a way to support the poor in your society. What obligations does a society have to its underprivileged? So this becomes basically, the Torah is an expression of the ideals of what Israel can and should be. So that's the first part of the Jewish Bible. The second part of the Jewish Bible is the prophets, Nevi'im. In the Christian Bible, they come at the end. And we think of the prophets as predicting the future. They actually do a lot more than that. They look at their society, they analyze their society, and they ask, what's going wrong and how can we fix it? What's going wrong and how can we fix it? And when we look at the prophets in the Jewish form of the Bible, there are two sections: the former prophets and the latter prophets. The former prophets are books that in the Christian Bible are considered historical: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And you may ask, why are they considered prophets? Because in Jewish tradition, the authors of each book are considered a prophet. Joshua is said to have written the book of Joshua. He's considered a prophet in Judaism. Samuel, the prophet, is considered as the author of Judges and Samuel. Even though he gets to die in Samuel, he's still considered one of the author of the books of Samuel as well as Judges. And the books of Kings in Judaism, the traditional author for Kings is Jeremiah, one of the major prophets of the Hebrew Bible. When you look at these books, they don't just give you an account of history, they give you an interpretation of history. Because the former prophets want to ask, when you read a history, you want to ask, what principles is it organized on? And what question does it ask? Former prophets ending in Kings ends with the Babylonian exile. And so you've got a history that's written asking the question, why? Why did the Babylonian exile happen? Why did we lose land? Why was the temple destroyed? Why did we end up exiled in Babylonia? And it gives you, the former prophets give you a reading of history that argues that throughout history, Israel did not always observe the will of God. They became pagan, they followed other gods, they didn't implement the laws of the Torah, they sinned against God. And so it ends with an explanation, why did we lose the land? Didn't observe Torah. When you move to the latter prophets, the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 prophets, Daniel is not included in the Jewish prophets of the Bible. It's part of the later group. But these prophets also look at their societies and ask, what's going wrong and how do you set it right? When you read Isaiah, you read a prophet that's basically formed by the Davidic tradition. The notion that God has an eternal covenant with King David, to have a Davidic monarch on the throne at all times, and that Zion or Jerusalem will be the capital or the center for Israel. And basically Isaiah argues that the reason that Israel is exiled is because they didn't believe enough in that tradition. Belief becomes a major issue in Isaiah. Jeremiah is not quite like Isaiah. He is a priest, a Mosaic priest. His message is, you don't observe enough Torah. You don't do what God asks of you, hence exile comes. But Jeremiah, like Isaiah, also posits restoration. Isaiah argues in the end, we'll come back to Jerusalem. So does Jeremiah. Ezekiel, the priest, Zadokite priest of the Jerusalem temple, his argument is that exile comes because the temple is rendered impure. People don't do what they're supposed to and basically destroy the sanctity of the temple. And essentially, Ezekiel's view is that the temple must be purged, purified, and a new temple must be built. So that by the end of the book, you see a vision of a new temple in Ezekiel that will represent new holiness and will transform the world. Even the Dead Sea will become a fertile place where you've got fishermen out on boats, where you've got fruit trees growing by the edge. It's not desolate as it had been in the past. 12 prophets, 12 individual prophets, but considered as one book, again, looking at problems in Israel's history and positing a restoration. Now, with those books of the prophets, Nevi'im, in the center, then one has to ask, what are they pointing to? And the answer is restoration. Where do you find restoration? In the Jewish Bible, in the writings. And when you look at the structure or the contents of the writings, the third section of the Bible, you find the Psalms where people worship. What is Israel supposed to do? Well, one thing, worship God. Psalms is the hymn book of the Jerusalem temple. How do you reinstitute temple worship? Proverbs, Job, how do you reflect on the nature of our world? Daniel projects the time when God will enter history and restore the purity of that temple. Ezra and Nehemiah speak about the rebuilding of the temple. And Chronicles ends the Ketuvim, or ends the writings with projection of a history from the time of creation to the present, in which King Cyrus of Persia is pointing to the restoration of the temple. That sense of restoration permeates the Ketuvim, that someday the temple will be rebuilt, Jews will return to Jerusalem, and the temple will be rendered holy once again. And that notion of an ideal in the Torah, its disruption in the prophets, and its potential restoration in the Ketuvim defines the theological viewpoint of a Jewish Bible. Ideal, disruption of ideal, restoration of ideal. Very much the question that Judaism is asking today in the aftermath of the Shoah or the Holocaust. What kinds of ideals do we have in the Jewish tradition? How have those ideals been disrupted by the deliberate murder of 6 million Jews, not to mention about 6 million others of various types, whether they be Slavic peoples or gays and lesbians, or people who are rendered disabled in one way or another? The Nazis didn't have just one target on their list. They had a number of them. And the fact of the matter is, looking around the room, most of us would have been on that target list. And so Judaism now is asking the question, how do we rebuild in the aftermath of the Shoah? And looking towards that question of restoration. What does it mean to have a modern Israel restored in the aftermath of World War II? And what role does the diaspora community, those of us in America, Europe, South America, and elsewhere in the world, how do we relate to Israel? Or how do we relate to the whole of the Jewish people? And so you see in the Jewish Tanakh a very different theological perspective of ideal, disruption, and restoration that's different from the linear development of the Christian Old Testament that moves from one period to the next and anticipates a third. So given the time limit I've got, why don't we conclude that now, and I'll open it up to a response by Professor Randall Chestnut.
Let me thank Professor Sweeney for a stimulating presentation and for doing what studies of the biblical canon often do not do. Numerous studies of the process of the development of the canon and the arrangement of the material talk a lot about when and where and how the various writings were collected and arranged in their present form, but they don't explore the impact that this has on the way we look at the various writings, as if somehow the arrangement of the material is a neutral theological act, but of course it's not. The placement of the books within the overall corpus does affect the way that it's read, and as you brought out very well, the way that the Hebrew Bible, or in Christian terms the Old Testament, is read is determined largely by the respective contexts in which they appear in the Jewish and Christian collections, although they share, for the most part, the same books. In the interest of time, I have some responses to make, but in the interest of time, I think I'll open it up and see if there are questions that you'd like Professor Sweeney to respond to, and I'd rather hear your questions and his response than mine. So if you have questions or things that you'd like to ask about, feel free to do that now, and we'll have him take a stab at responding. Okay, sure.
Well, in our religion 101 class, we talk about the Old Testament anticipating the New Testament, but how would a Jewish biblical theologian look at that as not anticipating the New Testament?
Well, in fact, in Judaism, one thing to learn about the Jewish Bible is that it does not include the New Testament. And for Judaism, Jesus Christ is irrelevant theologically. People ask, what's the Jewish view on Jesus? There isn't a Jewish view on Jesus, at least not a common one. Most of what you're going to get is individual responses, that he's irrelevant theologically to Judaism. Some might say, well, he might be an important teacher, but not for us. And he may have been Jewish, but eventually led to Christianity as a religion that largely spoke to the Gentiles or the nations. And in fact, when you look beyond the Bible in Jewish thought, that question of Israel's relationship to the nations is in fact an important question. And you see it raised already in the Bible. 2nd Isaiah, if I can even use that term, the book of Isaiah asks, basically, how do Jews relate to the nations? And so you get this notion of this sense of giving Torah to the nations or being a light to the nations that has been interpreted in various movements of both medieval and modern Judaism as a means of thinking about Israel's or Judaism's relationship to the world at large. In rabbinic terms, it's already addressed in a section of the Talmud that speaks about the laws of Noah. And if you know Genesis chapter 9, at the end of the flood, God makes a covenant with Noah that says basically human beings are allowed to eat meat for the first time, but part of their obligation is not to eat blood, because blood is the seed of life and is treated differently. And so Judaism develops the kosher dietary laws, a major principle of which is that an animal is slaughtered supposedly without pain. The blood is drained and allowed to go back into the earth because blood is considered holy and is not consumed. And so in Jewish practice, you eat only certain forms of meat, and they have to be slaughtered in a way that causes the animal no pain. Basically, it bleeds to death and falls asleep. and that the blood is not consumed. Well, the rabbis then developed what they called the laws of Noah, which developed Judaism's interrelationship with the nations, in which they argued that the nations are part of the covenant, so to speak, but have a different set of obligations than Jews do. Jews have the entirety of Jewish law to observe. The nations have only a certain number of obligations. One is to set up law courts of justice. Another is to make sure that meat is not eaten alive, that is, with the blood in it. And so when you look at these laws, a third is to believe in God. Actually, that's the first. I've not given them in order, but you get a set of requirements like this that basically call upon the nations: observe God, set up courts of justice, do not eat meat with the blood in it, and several others. That then defines a sense of holy action that is incumbent upon the nations. And in Rabbinic Judaism, then religions are effectively evaluated. Do they meet this criteria or not to be considered valid? Islam met it very early. Christianity, there was a question: how does the Trinity fit in to understandings of worshiping one God? Is there one God in Christianity, or are there three? And ultimately, Christianity was accepted as a valid religion. Hinduism is under consideration in Buddhism now. Because if you know anything about Hinduism and Buddhism, Hinduism has a number of different gods, but in Hindu thought, they all relate to the same identity. They're all different expressions, much like the Trinity represents different expressions of the one God. In Buddhism, you don't have a deity per se, but you have this sense of holiness that then comes in and gives it possibilities to be understood as a true religion in the world. So that's the rabbinic view, that yes, Judaism has a relationship with the other religions. In later periods, in Lurianic Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, the notion of exile was reinterpreted. Why are Jews exiled into the world? The Lurianic Kabbalists argued that Jews were exiled into the world to bring knowledge of God to the entire world, and thereby to help restore or sanctify the entire world. And in later movements of Jewish thought, in European Judaism, Moses Mendelssohn, an Enlightenment Jewish thinker, took up that notion of Lurianic Kabbalah and argued that exile or diaspora was a way of spreading knowledge of God to the Gentile world. And so you got this sense that Christianity would represent one form of that knowledge of God, Islam another, and then again the potentials for understanding Hinduism and Judaism. So the answer is, Jesus Christ is not an issue. Jesus Christ is an issue for Christians. But the other religions of the world do not accept Jesus Christ as a divine being, or in any sense related to God. But they each have their own paths of holiness and social organization, and that's where Judaism focuses. How does Christianity organize itself? How does it set up justice? How does it relate to other nations and other religious traditions? Those become the criterion by which to understand Judaism's relationship with others. Christians see it differently. They want to know, how is Christ understood throughout the world? And Christianity has the sense of self-obligation to bring Christ to the rest of the world. The rest of the world isn't looking for Christ. Well, Christians do that. So it becomes a difference of worldview. And one of the ways to think about that is that God creates different religions in the world. We're monotheists. We like to think of our own as the valid religion. But how does each religion then give us a sense of what the divine is looking for? Judaism, holy action. Christianity, how does suffering on the part of God then become a model for us to endure suffering and try to overcome suffering in the world? Islam, a sense of justice in the world. These become different ways of looking at God through different lenses, and gives us a model for thinking about the interrelationship. If you want to find a text for that, the text in the Bible. All the nations shall come up to Mount Zion and worship God in Micah. And then it also shows up in Isaiah. In Micah, the questions that's asked, or that's the statement that's made, each nation worships its own God. We in Israel worship our God, but in effect accept the other nations of the world the right to worship God as they see fit.
Any questions?
In the first part of your talk, you commented briefly on the fact that in the Christian New Testament, when when there are instances in which the so-called Old Testament is being quoted, it's a Greek translation that's being quoted. And of course, we know that translation is always already interpretation, right? So I'm curious what you think about, or how a number of these different English translations of the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh affect what you're calling a Jewish biblical theology. And the reason I ask is because I like to teach, I teach Everett Fox's 5 Books of Moses. That's my favorite translation. It preserves the ellipses, it preserves the spaces, the poetry, the lyricism of the Hebrew Bible. And I don't see that in the JPS version of the Tanakh, for instance. So I'm just curious what role that plays in shaping a Jewish biblical theology for you.
It actually doesn't shape a Jewish biblical theology because it's a question that's asked from the standpoint of Christianity. And so it actually becomes a question of Christian biblical theology. And the answer here is that when you look at the Christian Bible, I focused on the Septuagint. But as I mentioned in the lecture, the Christian Bible actually comes in a variety of forms. So I mentioned Septuagint, Ethiopic, those are the 2 I chose. But it also includes the Hebrew Masoretic text, the Jewish form of the Bible. And so for Christianity, the Jewish form of the Bible is another form of witness. So you've got the Masoretic Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint Greek Bible in a variety of forms, the Syriac Peshitta, the Latin Vulgate, the Ethiopian canon. All of these represent different understandings of the Bible. So Christianity actually has a different task when it comes to biblical theology. Judaism only has to interpret the Hebrew Masoretic text. Christianity has to account for a variety of canonical forms, of which Judaism is one. And in fact, Christianity has been asking that question for centuries. How do we understand the Hebrew text of the Bible, recognizing that the Greek renders it differently? If you've taken introductory Bible here, and you read Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in your New Revised Standard Bibles, you'll read a translation that says, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless and void, or whatever, which runs counter to the traditional translation, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. And the difference is that the translation, when God began to create, the earth was formless and void. The earth was already there. It presents God as taking something chaotic and bringing it into order. If you translate, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, God creates everything from the outset. In fact, the traditional translation expresses the Septuagint's rendering of the text, not the Hebrew. And so what's happening is that Christianity is looking more and more at the Jewish Bible and Jewish Bible interpretation, because that understanding comes up in rabbinic interpretation. Rashi, the medieval linguist who pointed this out. Christianity is looking closely at Judaism and, in effect, establishing a relationship with Judaism, because for Christianity, the Masoretic form of the Bible, or the Jewish form of the Bible, is part of what Christianity understands its Bible to be. And this is an issue you see in the past. Most of you are going to come from a Western tradition of Christianity. Septuagint, the Greek, was the original Bible of Christianity in the New Testament. But very early on, in the 4th century, you get the Latin Vulgate. Why? Because St. Jerome recognized the problem of differing translations in Greek, because the Greek doesn't always have the same reading. It varies. And tried to produce a standardized version of the Bible in which he consulted with rabbis of his time to give an accurate Latin translation of the Bible, naming it the Vulgate, which means the common version that could be read by everyone, just the same as Peshitta in Syriac used in the East. Peshitta also means common version, rendered in Eastern Aramaic or the Syriac text, which is much closer to the Hebrew. So already in early Christian history, this question of the relationship to the Jewish Bible was actually paramount. And so you see movements within Christianity in time to try to bring the Bible back to its Jewish origins. You're Protestant here, so Martin Luther had the same issue. That's why he took the Apocrypha out of the Bible, trying to bring the Bible back to its Jewish origin. And that question actually has been an ongoing question in Christian thought. Still going on today, hence you see this translation, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, in the New Revised Standard Version, one of the standard English translations of the Bible.
Thank you. We have to stop for reasons of time. I'm sure that Professor Sweeney would be glad to stay around. I'll volunteer him to do this if you have any individual questions, but within the interest of time, we have to stop. Before we do that, I'd like to present you this pen from the Glazer Institute as a gift of thanks for being here. And